Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Schwenkfelder Library and Heritage Center. We're really excited to have Doug Miller here with us, but I also wanted to just give you a little bit more information before we get started today. First of all, we're really excited to have received a grant from the Pew Foundation, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, to fund the work with the Delaware Tribe of Indians out of Oklahoma over the next 2 years. So, keep a lookout for all the programs and everything that we'll be doing for that. Also, for anyone that is new, that has not visited us before, if you include your email down where you signed in, we'll gladly send you our online newsletter and everything to keep up to date with everything that we're doing. This coming March, we have a couple different things going on. March 11th will be our next brown bag, where Bob Wood will actually present on the log buildings of the 18th century in southeastern Pennsylvania. And then we also have Jeremy Johnson, who is from the Delaware Tribe of Indians out of Oklahoma. He is going to do a Zoom lecture from Oklahoma on the cultural continuity and connection Wednesday, March 18th. So if you are not able to do a Zoom at home, you're welcome to join us here, and we'll put the Zoom on here for you to learn from that experience. Can we get a round of applause for Doug Miller?
Thank you all for coming. I work at a place called Pennsbury Manor. It's William Penn's home. And Penn, of course, is legendary for his relations with Native Americans, in particular, the people he was dealing with the most, not solely, but the most, were the Lenape. And when I was first asked about giving a talk here, it was, could I talk about the Lenape? And I said, well, that's really not my history. That's their history, and it's their story to tell. And in the introduction, we heard about the Zoom program that'll be next month with Jeremy Johnson. And I had the great pleasure of getting to know Jeremy through our work together at Pennsbury Manor. And when I first met Jeremy, he and I were having a cup of coffee in the visitor center. And one of the two things that he said to me still sticks, which was, I hate it when people tell me my history. So I would encourage all of you to get it from him, because historians, archaeologists have written histories about the Lenape, and you're not getting all of the history if you don't talk to somebody who carries that bloodline, who has grown up in that culture. And I promise you, he's an outstanding speaker. So please, please take advantage of that. However, we're here to hear a little bit about Penn and the Indians, and totally the antithesis of what I just said. I am going to give a little bit of background on who these Lenape people were. For dozens, if not hundreds of years, archaeologists and anthropologists and historians have told the descendants of the Lenape, your people were here for 3,000 to 5,000 years. And the descendants of the Lenape have all said, no, we were here longer than that. And the scientists and the historians all said, no, the evidence doesn't support that. Well, then they looked at the evidence again and they said, okay, it's 5,000 to 7,000 years that you were here. And they said, no, we were here longer than that. And then they reevaluated the evidence again, and it was 8,000 to 12,000 years. Okay, we're up to about 15,000 to 20,000 years. And as I was driving in off of the Northeast Extension on 663, and I got to the sign out here for the Perkiomen watershed. Perkiomen is a Native American term. And this is a story that I've heard from Jeremy. Perkiomen, loosely translated, is where cranberries are found. The legend within the Lenape tribes of where cranberries come from is warriors were hunting mastodons and they lost the fight. And where they were stomped into a pulp is where cranberries come up. My point of sharing that story, and he will tell it far better than I ever could, is their stories and their heritage goes that far back. And academic historians and anthropologists and so on have been dismissive of that. And we're actually finding out, yes, there's a whole lot of truth to that. Some of you might have seen where Native American footprints have been found in a dried lake bed in New Mexico. When that person put his foot down, it actually squashed pollen spores underneath the foot, and they're able to radiocarbon date those pollen spores to plus or minus 50 years. They're 23,000 years old. How many in this audience heard the whole story of the land bridge that, people only came over, 9 to 12,000 years ago? Well, that guy must have been Mark Spitz if he swam the whole way across the ocean to get here. So it's an exciting time to rediscover and reevaluate the history we thought we knew. What we believe is the Lenape people lived in this region anywhere from 12 to 20,000 years ago. Lenape, loosely translated, would translate as the people. This is fairly common in Native American cultures. I'll use another one that everyone should be familiar with. You've heard of the Navajo. The Navajo actually call themselves Dene. In their language, it would be Dene. Today, we call the Lenape Delaware, and we'll get to where that name comes from. Dene in Navajo loosely translates to the people. And it's pretty common with Native American tribes. That's what they call themselves. Today, the US government recognizes 574 Native American tribes, Pacific Islanders, Alaskan people who are our first people. And the Canadians actually host two groups of Lenape under the name Lenape as First Peoples of Canada. I always like that term, First Peoples, because it really sums it up well. And I think we could learn a little bit from our northern neighbors in recognizing the first people who were here. So the Lenape are here for probably 10 to 20,000 years. I was going through my news feeds within the last 2 days, and there is a museum up in Manhattan that has the remains of a small bit of remains of a ship that was found when they were building skyscrapers in the 19 teens. They have identified that ship, they believe, as the Tiger, spelled with a Y. It was a Dutch trade ship that caught fire and sank in 1613. And the Lenape take them in. They care for these shipwrecked people. They actually help them build another boat, and that boat is used to map parts of the Hudson. Yes, the Dutch were doing it at about the same time Henry Hudson was. I bring it up because it's over 400 years ago. And unfortunately for the Lenape, that relationship with the Dutch will not last. To understand how the Lenape were organized in the 17th century, which would be the 1600s or the point of European contact, I always like to use the analogy of Scottish clans. Those of us that go to the 20th century and we're now in the 21st century usually look at it as there's a chief and there's kind of this pyramid scheme. Scottish clans were organized in family bands, and they share a common language base. They come together in times of national crisis. For the Scots, it was any time the English are around, they get together and hate on the English. For the Lenape, if there were times of national emergency, perhaps people encroaching on their lands, that's when they would band together. But they would stay in these small kind of clans. So when early settlers get here, they think they're dealing with one group because they're coming from an area that's under a king. They have to deal with lots of groups. Well, the Dutch don't only sink ships in the New York area, they actually decide to show up and try to settle there. How many have heard the story of Manhattan in the sale of Manhattan for $24 of glass beads? Yeah, we've all heard that story. Jeremy corrected me on their side of the story. At that time in Lenape culture, you would do annual tribute. Your treaties were on an annual basis. So the Dutch show up thinking, we're going to buy this under European standards. You pay for it, it's yours. The Lenape are looking at it as a beach rental. And they chose to disagree forever. Later, the Dutch will have a colonial governor who comes over, and much to the displeasure of the Dutch colonists that are in New Amsterdam, which we would know as the New York area, this guy starts genocide against the Lenape. His name is Kieft. It's called Kieft's War. There will be 200 Lenape people. The children are thrown into the Hudson, and the parents are driven in at bayonet point, so they all drowned. It starts genocide against them under Dutch rule. The Lenape weren't just in the Delaware drainage, they were in the Hudson drainage. They were a powerhouse of the 17th century. To the south, their native rivals would have been the Powhatan. To the west, the Susquehannock in the Susquehanna drainage. The Susquehannock really called themselves Conestoga. And to the north, the soon-to-be confederated Iroquois-speaking groups up there. But, as I said, as a military force, as well as a social force, the Lenape are people of great substance. As Europeans come, we bring with us diseases that indigenous people have no resistance to, and it devastates the populations. I'll give you a hard luck story. It's not a Lenape story, but there is a English expedition that's going to map the coast of New England. While they're doing this, they capture half a dozen Native Americans and spirit them off to England, where they will become enslaved people. 5 years later, one of them manages to get his freedom, and he hitches a ride back to the Plymouth area where he comes from. His name's Squanto. And when he arrives, he finds that his village and most of the people are dead. And we believe it's from these European diseases. So Squanto gets captured by the rival tribe, the Wampanoag, and is enslaved again to the king of the Wampanoag, or the Sachem, Massasoit. And of course, his story is ingrained in the culture of New England and Plymouth and the Pilgrims. I bring it up because what happened to his tribe was happening to other tribes. And the Lenape were being ravaged by these diseases as well. Well, the Dutch set up 3 trading posts in the New World. One down at Cape Henlopen. This is the early 1620s, just a couple years after, the Pilgrims land, just a decade after Jamestown is established. One is actually between Morrisville and Trenton on an island that we don't think exists any longer. And the third one is up in New York at a place called Fort Orange, which today we would know as Albany. Well, the people down at Cape Henlopen, that settlement, the Dutch settlement, is called Swanendel. And basically, there is a misunderstanding between the Lenape people and the Dutch. This mid-level Sachem is going through the woods. He keeps passing this little plaque, metal plaque, nailed up to a tree. And the Dutch are famous for putting up kind of, "We own this land" signs. Well, after 6 months, this guy's like, "It's obviously abandoned. I can use that." So he takes it and he's going to maybe roll it up, make it into a pipe. We're not sure what his motivation was, but the Dutch complain about this to the local delegation of Lenape. What they don't understand is in the Lenape culture, theft is a capital offense. And the Lenape basically present the Dutch with this guy's head. Well, the Dutch are aghast, "Why would you do this? We didn't mean for this to happen," and so on. And if you lose a family member in Lenape culture at this time, you can ask for reparations. Cash, tribute, payments, or in blood. And the family determines they want it in blood. So in a surprise attack, Swanendel is wiped off the map. The livestock that the Dutch had bought were free ranging, and they were ranging into Lenape planted fields. So all the livestock are killed and their heads are put up on pikes. The explorer De Vries finds the aftermath of this. This is how historians think we have pieced it together. I wasn't there, so I can't attest to it. However, uh, the Dutch withdraw from that area between Trenton and Morrisville. They abandon that post. Fort Orange sticks. A couple things about the Lenape of the 17th century. They were not imperial. They weren't trying to expand their territory when they would go to war, and they were very adept warriors. And all of us that grew up here in southeastern PA have heard all the stories of Lenape being peaceful and so on, which is a lot of truth to that. But the truth is also they're very able warriors when they choose to be. They will go to war when their boundaries are transgressed. They will fight to maintain the homeland. So the Dutch move out and the Swedes move in. They establish a colony here in the 1630s. The colonial governor here under Swedish control was a fellow named Johann Prince. And there's no really polite way to put this. This guy was portly. He was about my height, went about 300 pounds. The Prinshof was his home, and he was encouraging Dutch settlers to put in cash crops rather than try to do subsistence farming. And he explained to him, he says, listen, you can buy your food cheaper from the Lenape people. And it really establishes an ongoing market economy that will be sustained in Pennsylvania for a long time between the Lenape people, whoever's in colonial power at that point, and the settlers that are here. So, unfortunately for the Swedes, there is a European war, and the Dutch defeat the Swedes in Europe. So the Dutch get to take over the territorial holdings of New Sweden. It's all part of New Amsterdam. Unfortunately for the Lenape, the word has spread about Kief's War. There was a Swannendel incident, so they're really not hot on having the Dutch here. Okay, now it's time to get to a little bit of William Penn history. So, who's this William Penn guy? Well, I'm going to go back 2 generations in his lineage to start us out. We've got William Penn's grandfather, a guy named Giles Penn. He's a merchant, mid-level guy in London, but his mercantile business buys stuff from North Africa. So Giles is going back and forth. I bring it up because the Penns are used to being on the sea. And while in North Africa, Barbary pirates had kidnapped 200 English citizens, and they're holding them for ransom. Kind of like the Somali pirates today. Well, one of the guys that negotiates their safe release is Giles Penn. For that, it catches the eye of the king at that time, Charles I, who awards Giles a diplomatic posting to Morocco. I bring up the story because it starts the Penns intersecting with the crown. Well, Giles was a fair diplomat, not a great merchant, so he didn't have a whole lot to come and go on, but he had raised enough money to buy his son, William Penn Sr., not our William Penn, but our William Penn's daddy, a captaincy in the Royal Navy. And I would say that Captain Penn took to sailing like a fish took to water. He distinguishes himself in battle off the coast of Ireland and becomes a rising star in the Royal Navy. 1644, he meets a beautiful Dutch expatriate, weds her, and that same year, their firstborn son, William Penn Jr., our William Penn, is born. So the great thing about being now an admiral in the Royal Navy, when Admiral Penn's fleet takes a prize, the admiral gets a third, the King of England gets a third, and the crew gets a third. And I worked with a board member who was kind of a pain in my posterior, who loved to say it was legalized piracy. And I would always point out, listen, if you are under command of the crown, it's not piracy. You are acting for your government. And I would push back and I said, You know, when we took Japanese shipping and German shipping in World War II, do you think we gave it back? For as long as people have been on the high seas, this is how it's been happening. So Captain Penn, later Admiral Penn, will build a tremendous war chest, and he gives his son the best opportunities in education. So young William is sent off to Chigwell Elementary School in England. While he's there, he has two life-altering events. He basically has his first vision of God. He's a very spiritual young man, and he has a near-death experience. He contracts smallpox, which should be a death sentence, but he's with a wealthy family, and there's all these miracle cures of modern medicine. So they dose young William, and he's cured. What they gave him was raw mercury. It not only killed the smallpox, but it also killed a lot of his hair follicles, something that I can contest with. Uh, and at age 11, he starts to wear wigs because he had developed early pattern baldness. Uh, from Chigwell, he's off to Oxford. He's at Oxford for about a year. When the faculty writes to Admiral Penn, your son is a pain in the behind. We don't like him here, so please take him home. So yes, William Penn gets kicked out of Oxford. His dad's like scratching his head. What do I do with this kid? So he sends him off to Saumur, France, to study at a Huguenot academy. While there, he's introduced to something that Huguenots are oppressing in France because they are being oppressed there. They would like to see religious toleration in France. Sound familiar? So young Penn finishes his studies there. He tours Europe for 2 years, actually gets into a duel in Paris, disarms his opponent. Later in life, he'll write about this experience. He was really weirded out by it, that over a social slight, you could come to near fatal blows. Keep in mind, he's in a military family. He's been taught how to bear arms, how to defend himself. He's an expert swordsman. Well, while all this is going on in young William's life, England has a whole bunch of unrest because a civil war has broken out. The King of England, Charles I, is facing off against Oliver Cromwell, who's leading the opposition. Cromwell wants strong Puritan values reinstilled in England, and he wants a strong parliament, and he wants rid of the king. The king, of course, tells everyone, God made me king, and you people should do what I say. Unfortunately for Charles I, he not only loses a civil war, but he will lose his head along the way. And for about a 10-year period, which is pretty austere, the country is under this puritanical rule of Oliver Cromwell, but it does establish a strong parliament. Admiral Penn is in the military, but he's not involved in a civil war at home. He is fighting on foreign shores for the good of England. While this is going on, Parliament cuts off military spending. Or as I'd like to put it, the executive branch is not playing nicely with the legislative branch. Once again, sound familiar? Uh, the admiral takes money out of his war chest to keep the campaign going. This story will connect in just a little bit. Well, Oliver Cromwell dies. I hated to see him pass because he had the coolest title around. He was the Lord Defender of England. I always thought that would look good on my business card, Lord Defender of Pennsbury Manor. However, after this, the populace actually was aghast that you would behead a king, and they liked the idea of having a monarch back, but they also like having a strong parliament. So 11 prominent English citizens are chosen to cross the English Channel to Brittany. We would think of Brittany as part of France, but at that instant in history, it's actually part of England. Before losing his head, Charles II was a breeder. He had two sons. Charles I has two sons. You have Charles II and his kid brother James. One of those prominent English citizens to plead the case, Admiral Sir William Penn. On board his ship is his upstart son, young William. They sit down with Charles II and say, honestly, if you come back and become king, we promise not to cut your head off. And Charles agrees. In a glorious restoration, Charles II ascends the throne. For every bit of austere England up to that point, he is over the top opulent. and the populace eats it up with a spoon. Shortly thereafter, for the fourth out of five times in the 17th century, the Dutch and the English will go to war. They are trade rivals, and they're both maritime countries. Admiral Penn is the best sailor that they have. He is the third highest guy in the Royal Navy at this point, and they have him assemble a fleet. On board his ship is the head of the Royal Navy, and they sail off to the Dutch coast in a sweeping sea battle called Lowencroft. Admiral Penn is victorious. They sail back into London. There are lots of accolades. And the admiral, who is a brilliant politician, takes two steps back. He says, it's all about the head of the Royal Navy. He was telling me everything to do. Until people start to question, why didn't you follow up? Once you had their fleet crippled, why didn't you go and totally destroy it? Then the admiral steps forward. He said, listen, I had wounded. My ships were damaged too. We needed to withdraw. That was my call. Protecting the head of the Royal Navy, who happens to be the kid brother of the King of England. And that kid brother gets to take over New Amsterdam and rebrand it because he's the Duke of York. Thus, we get New York. Well, who's living in what was New York at that time? The Lenape. Because New York actually extended the whole way down until it bumped into the Calverts of Maryland. There was no Pennsylvania at this point. Well, shortly thereafter, there's a mutiny, an uprising of troops in Ireland. Young William Penn is dispatched to there and sees battle at Carrickfergus. How many of you guys knew William Penn, the would-be Quaker, was a combat veteran? While in Ireland, he stops by a clothier's. He is very much a fop. He liked to dress like I do. And while he's there, this clothier is a Quaker. And he tells a story. He said, listen, when my dad and I were in London, we met this very, very compelling orator now named Thomas Lowe. And my dad invited him back to the family place in London. And he moved my father so much he was brought to tears at the dinner table. And that clothier says, you know, Thomas Lowe's speaking a couple towns over. And Penn hops on his horse. He goes there and within a year makes his life conversion to Quakerism. Breaks his dad's heart, breaks their relationship. He will be caned, thrown out. They'll reconcile and so on. But it's a broken relationship between father and son. Daddy was grooming him to go into the Royal Navy. Quakers were not, they were pacifists. And Penn had already been weirded out by that sword fight, and he had seen battle firsthand. Also, his experience as a young man at Chigwell, he felt God had spoken to him directly. So the idea of the inner light within Quakerism, that everyone can have a direct conduit to God, really was something that was attractive to young William. Dad passes away. Young William has inherited quite a lot. He is a member of aristocracy at this point. And while in London, there are two Quakers who can't get along over their investments in the New World. It's called West Jersey. If you're Quaker, you take your dispute to meeting, you don't go to court. And Penn helps them negotiate this, but finds out one of the proprietary interests in West Jersey is available. So he actually buys in and invests in West Jersey in the 1670s, writes some of the founding legislation for what will ultimately become the state of New Jersey. Well, 5, 6 years later, Quakers being Quakers, they can't all come to consensus still. Penn looks around and he looks at this model of Maryland. It's a family-owned colony. The Calverts have established it under the guise of religious toleration until the 1660s when they rescind that. So I always remind my friends in Maryland of that. But it was set up as a Catholic enclave primarily. Penn will petition the crown for land in the New World. The guy who actually owns the land is James, the kid brother. So in March of 1681, they have basically come to terms. They will grant 4 longitudinal lines west of the Delaware River, the dividing line for West Jersey, or the ending point of West Jersey, to William Penn to establish his own proprietary colony. Charles II asks William Penn, "What will you call your colony?" And Penn proudly stands up and says, "New Wales." Charles had an advisor from Wales who absolutely hated the Penn family, and he tells the king, "Don't do it, it's a bad idea." So Charles says, "I'm not hot on the Wales thing. Give me an alternative." Penn, who was a scholar and a linguist, says Sylvania in Latin woodlands. Charles responds, "My family, the crown, our country, England, owes a debt to your father that we can never fully repay. So we're going to name the colony Pennsylvania in his honor." How many of you thought Pennsylvania was named for the Quaker guy? The great irony of history, this holy experiment is based on a military debt, the amount of money that Admiral Penn had laid out to fight on those foreign shores, and it's named for an English war hero. I think it's one of the greatest examples of taking a sword and beating it into a plowshare you're going to find. So Penn starts to pamphlet for people to come to his colony. He chooses his cousin to be his lieutenant governor, Captain William Markham, a seafaring captain. Writes letters of introduction because we feel there's between 800 and 1,200 people of European descent who are living on land that they had gotten from James that will now be part of Penn's colony. And of course, there are indigenous people living here. So if you guys will indulge me, I want to go right to William Penn for his letter of introduction to the Lenape. I will point out that he doesn't know the word Lenape yet, so this letter goes to the King of the Canadas. So, my friends, there's one great God and power that has made the world and all things therein, to whom you, I, and all people owe their being and well-being, and to whom you and I must one great day give an account for all that we do in the world. This great God has written his law in our hearts, which we are taught and commanded to love and help and do good to one another, and be pleased to make your concerns my concerns in this part of the world. And the king desires to enjoy it with you with your love and consent, that we may always love together as neighbors and friends. Else, what would the great God say to us, who has made us not to devour and destroy one another, but to live soberly and kindly together in this world? Now, I would have you well observe that I am very sensible of the unkindness and injustices that have been too much exercised towards you by the people of these parts of the world, who have sought for themselves to make great advantages upon you, rather than be examples of justice and goodness unto you, which I hear has been a matter of trouble to you and caused great grudgings and animosities, sometimes the shedding of blood, which has made the great God angry. But I am not such a man, as is well known in my country. I have a great love and regard towards you, and I desire to win and gain your love and friendship by kind, just, and peaceful life, to win and gain for all people. The people that I send to you are of the same mind, and shall in all things behave themselves accordingly. And if anything or any shall offend you or your people, you shall have full and speedy satisfaction for the same group of an equal number of honest on both sides, that by no means you may have an occasion of being offended against them. I shall shortly come to you myself, and at what time we may largely and freely confer and discourse the matters. In the meantime, I've sent my commissioners to treat with you about the land and firm league of peace. Let me desire you to be kind to them and to people, and conceive and receive these presents as tokens which I have sent to you as testimony of my goodwill and friendship, that we may live justly and peaceably and friendly with you. I am your friend, William Penn. I always love to share that letter because I think it speaks to Penn's intent when he starts this relationship with the Lenape people. I also want to give a shout out to Charles II. Everyone paints William Penn as the good guy here. Charles II was highly encouraging Penn to deal fairly with the indigenous people that were here. Why? In the 15 years prior to the Pennsylvania colony, there had been three terrible wars on this side of the Atlantic. There was one of many Anglo-Powhatan wars down in the Jamestown area. In central Pennsylvania in the 1670s, there's what's called the Fur Trade War that everyone has forgotten about. It's really between two indigenous groups, but it's being fueled by Dutch and English traders in New Amsterdam and ultimately what has become New York. Just because the English take over doesn't mean the Dutch who were living there leave. And the Calverts of Maryland. The Calverts are supplying the Susquehannock with arms, ammunition, and trade goods in exchange for furs and the fur trade. The Iroquois are doing the same up in New England. The difference is the Iroquois are imperial like the Romans. They will go down and conquer territories. 1674, the people in Maryland decide, man, maybe we better not give these people guns. Within a year, the Susquehannock are defeated, and it will be the end of that civilization. It'll be another approximately 80 years before the last vestiges are massacred by Pennsylvania militia at a place called Paxtang. The Paxtang boys kill, we think, the last of the group between 20 and 30 Christianized Conestogas. All the other ones have been amalgamated into other tribes. Their bloodline is not eradicated. They've been intermarried with other tribes and been adopted into other tribes. But that's the end of a culture that at one point had 3,000 to 5,000 person cities here in Pennsylvania. The Third War, remember we mentioned Massasoit up in New England? Massasoit's son is a guy named King Philip. King Philip starts a small little local war that snowballs, and different indigenous groups get involved. Ultimately, by the end of King Philip's War, 1/3 of the colonial population of New England has been eradicated. 50% of the native population has been eradicated. It is one of the most costly wars ever to occur on this side of the Atlantic, and everyone forgets it. These things are on the mind of the king, and the king, of course, wants peaceful relations. I would also argue that Penn did have a moral compass, and he wanted peaceful relations as well, both for his Quaker upbringing, but also for the good of a colony that he is entering into as an entrepreneurial activity, not just a spiritual one. So Penn starts to pamphlet across the European continent, as well as throughout England and English holdings for people who want to come and establish a life in a new world. And he actually starts to sell land sight unseen to investors. One of the investors will be his future father-in-law, Thomas Callowhill, as in Callowhill Street in Philadelphia. So Thomas Callowhill buys 5,000 acres sight unseen. Part of what Penn had asked of first purchasers, and I'll just pull out a little bit here, goes to the interaction that first purchasers are required by Penn's laws to deal with native peoples. Be tender, offering of the Indians. Hearken by honest spies. If you can hear that anybody inveighs the Indians not to sell or stand off and raise the value upon you, you cannot want that those informed unto you, but shall soften them to me and the people. Let them know that you are going to sit down lovingly among them. Let my letter and conditions with my purchases about just dealings with them be read in their tongue, and that many can see that they'll have great good in our eyes, equal and just in our own interests. And what I send to them, and make friendship and league with them accordingly, those conditions shall fall to you. Penn wasn't just walking that walk, he was asking everyone else to do so. Now, for the Lenape at this time, they had been losing large numbers of people, and it was not to warfare, to their rivals to the south, the Powhatans, the Susquehannock, who had been rivals in the early 1630s. There's a little bit of evidence of a border war between Susquehannock people and Lenape people. But Penn wants to make sure that the Lenape are treated fairly. Penn will be here for 2 years, and then a boundary dispute starts with his southern neighbors. Essentially, when Captain William Markham arrives, one of the people that he calls on is the Lord Baltimore. That is the hereditary title of the Calverts of Maryland. And those two are oil and water. They just can't get along. William Penn, when he arrives, chooses to call on Lord Baltimore and proudly tells Lord Baltimore that the southern boundary of Pennsylvania basically runs through modern day Baltimore. The Lord Baltimore chooses to disagree for the rest of his life. I always tease people that if William Penn had spontaneously combusted, Lord Baltimore wouldn't have tinkled on him. The Calvert claim goes back to Charles I, and it goes up to the 40th parallel. Penn's southern boundary is not established in the charter. It's how far west it goes, not how far north and south it goes. And fairly quickly, this dispute heats up. Penn's agents let him know that Lord Baltimore has returned to England to plead his case directly to the crown. Penn has to hop on a ship and go plead his case. Remember whose daddy put the king on the throne? So Charles sides with Penn, but doesn't codify it in writing. He gives Penn oversights of the lower counties, which we would know today as Delaware. So now Penn has his hand in what we would know as 3 states. Penn will not be able to return to England for 15 years. A lot goes on during that time. Charles passes away. Kid brother James ascends the throne. James is Catholic and proud of it. He's out of the closet Catholic in Church of England dominated England. His daughter, Mary, has married a firebrand Church of England guy, William of Orange. And William begins to raise armies against his father-in-law. Remember what happened to James's father being beheaded? So James decides it's a good time to advocate. He kind of liked it in Brittany, and I'm going to go and have a vacation now. So he leaves, and we get the William and Mary period. William Penn is accused of treason. Treason is a capital offense. He is jailed. One of many times he'll end up in jail. I always thought at Pennsbury we should get temporary tattoos, a little prison tattoo of the teardrop with like Ben in it. So he will plead his own case. He will be found not guilty, but he's under house arrest for a couple of years. And it's a dark time for historians. We're really not sure what all's going on. There is a population explosion that happens here. Pennsylvania, the port of Philadelphia was easy to get into. New York, New England, not so easy. Penn had set up his colony on religious toleration. If we were all in England at that time and we weren't members of Church of England, like suppose there might be some Schwenkfelders in the audience. Well, you guys would have to pay a tithe to worship a tax as you chose. My ancestors, who were Swiss Mennonites, I always say Penn encouraged all the whack jobs of Europe, anyone that didn't fit in, and my ancestors proudly were Swiss Mennonites. We were very high on the whack job scale back then. But he gave them a place where they could come and establish new life and worship as they chose. And we have this richness of religious diversity here. England, not so much. And Penn will be under house arrest for a while. Shortly thereafter, he will have two devastating losses in his life. His first wife, Guliana Springett Penn. I teased my college interns. She was like the Victoria's Secret model of the 17th century because Guli was a looker. She was a fellow Quaker, probably every inch his intellectual equal, but we just don't know a lot. There's not a lot of evidence that has survived about her. They had a loving relationship. They had many children. The firstborn carrying on her family name, a young man named Springett, who will make it to age 22, who dad has invested all of his hopes in, groomed to take over, and Springett passes. Within the year, Gouldy has been lost as well, and he's at a very low point. For about 2 years, he mourns, and then he starts to take notice of the daughter of that first purchaser, Thomas Callahill, one of 9 children, the only one to survive to adulthood, and he begins to court her. And she blows him off. And there are these letters where he's getting more and more desperate. I've written to you 5 times. Why don't you get back to me? But fortunately, a third party intervenes on Penn's part, his daughter from the first marriage. And between Letitia and William, they wear Hannah down. She agrees to wed him. And I think of these two as a power couple. They will return to Pennsylvania in 1699. There is unrest with how Penn is governing the colony. We've talked a little bit about his relationship with Native peoples, but the populace wants more of a say-so in how things are done. Penn's first model had the governor as the chief executive. He would call legislature together when it's time to pass laws, and the laws would be passed to the people. All these people from all these different places want more of a say-so in their grub stake here. So grudgingly, Penn revisits this, and he writes the Charter of Privileges that picks up the nickname the Charter of Liberties. In it, there's a two-party system, like Senate and House. In it, the common man gets the right to vote, not just the landholders. In England at that time, and I always love this law, it goes back to the 1400s, the Knights of the Shire Act. The people who could elect parliament were only allowed to do so if they paid a certain amount in land taxes, the largest landholders of England, to the crown. 3% of English population could vote for parliament up to the point of the American Revolution. Penn establishes that the common man has this right. He establishes that if there are discrepancies with Native peoples, that there will be a jury made up half of Native peoples and half of English citizens. Because if you buy in here, if you're a Mennonite, if you're a Schwenkfelder and you come here, you are accepting English citizenship. Well, that law is so popular that 50 years later, they cast a bell for it that hangs in the State House. It has a crack in it, and nobody remembers that it's up there for Penn's Charter of Liberties. The Lenape are facing a great deal of expansion. Penn has set a precedent of buying the land as fairly as he can from the Lenape people. The historic site that I live at and work at, my wife believes I live there. She's probably right. Was bought by Captain William Markham for 2,164 pounds of trade goods. Here's some of the things that Penn paid for that land. 40 white blankets, 40 fathoms of strode water. Strode water is a cloth. 60 fathom of duffel. A fathom is a 6-foot length, by the way. 40 guns, 40 kersey coats, 60 shirts, 40 pairs of stockings, 20 mount care caps, 40 hoes, 40 axes, 3 anchors of powder, 300 small bars of lead, 200 knives, glasses, shoes, and it goes on and on. All of Pennsylvania is granted to Penn for 16,000 pounds sterling. This is 8% of what Penn paid for all of Pennsylvania. And I crossed swords with an academic one time who was adamant that Native peoples did not understand European land ownership. Remember the story of Manhattan Island? I'll buy it for the first generation. We're 3 generations, almost 4 into it, and Native peoples are not stupid. They wholly understood this. That land purchase will go from Morrisville inland to a native village called Playwicky and then follow the Neshaminy Creek down to its confluence with the Delaware. It's about 12 miles of river frontage. Some prime real estate today. So Penn is here for 2 years, but he's in financial distress. He has to return to England. The word has spread, and the native community turns out at Pennsbury en masse. 200 Native Americans, Sashems, and their entourages descend on Pennsbury Manor in October of 1681 to send Penn off. Let's see what they have to say about it. There's a pastor who's there who actually pens a letter to the King of England for some of the natives that are there. We, the kings and sachems of the ancient nations of the Susquehanna and Savannah Indians, understanding that our loving and good friend and brother, William Penn, is, to our great grief and trouble of all Indians in these parts, obliged to go back to England and to speak with the great king and his sachems about the government, we can do no less than acknowledge that he has always been just, but also very kind to us, as well as our ancient kings and sachems deceased, and careful to keep good correspondence with us, and suffering us not to receive any wrong from any people under his government. Giving to us is as well known his house as our home, and at times frequently entertaining us at his own cost, and often filling us with many presents and necessary goods for our clothing and other accommodations. Besides, he has paid us for our land, which no governor ever did before him. And we hope and desire that the great King of the English will be good and kind to him and his children, and grant that they may always govern these parts. And then we shall have confidence that we and our children, will be well used and encouraged to continue to live among the Christians according to the agreement that he and we have solemnly made for us and posterity, as long as the sun and the moon shall endure. One head, one mouth, one heart. We can say much more of his good counsel and instructions, which he has often given us and our people, to live sober and virtuous life. And the best way to please the great God is to be happy here and forever. But let this suffice to the king and his wise sachems, in love of our good friend and brother, William Penn. Penn will not return to Pennsylvania. His creditor was calling in the chit. The chit was Pennsylvania. It had been mortgaged to Philip Ford. To hear Penn's side of it, Ford was embezzling from him. To hear Ford's side of it, I lent hard cash to this guy who hemorrhages money, which William Penn did. He was not a good financial manager. And I want to be repaid. History doesn't know who is right. Ford will die before it's settled. Penn will be jailed in debtor's prison until wealthy Quakers buy him out. And he will eventually be disabled by stroke shortly after helping his wife, who had just lost her beloved father, Thomas Callahill, begin to settle the estate. Hannah is named as the executrix. William is passed over, and I think that's because Thomas Callahill knew, don't trust Penn with money. I bring up Hannah because she's a personal hero. She will run the colony from England for essentially 15 years. She is never given the credit for being the first female governor of Pennsylvania, but in function, that's what she did. She will, after a series of strokes, 5, Penn will pass in 1718. To comfort her in her mourning, the Lenape people will send her a fur robe lined with feathers. If you want to see one, we will be getting a modern reproduction on loan at Pennsbury Manor sometime this summer. And in talking to Jeremy about this, the cultural educator of the Delaware Tribe of Indians, he said, no, it's a feather robe lined with fur. Feathers shed water. They had it inside out. But I think it speaks to the relationship that, sadly, it will be Penn's sons who will propagate the infamous walking purchase. And the sons will actually, Hannah has passed away. They will buy a large plot of land, kind of the same way their father had. There's this population explosion. They need more land to sell at a markup as developers. It's not enough in their eyes. They ask for more land, specifically land up around the forks of the Delaware, and we're going to stay here. Negotiations go on for over a year. Ultimately, the eldest son, John, who picks up the nickname John the American because he was the only Penn child born this side of the Atlantic. Hannah was very pregnant for her sea voyage here in 1699. Negotiations, all of a sudden, a deed shows up. It's a governmental copy that shows that William Penn has paid for land, but the measurement was never taken, as far as a man can walk in a day and a half. And the understanding was that they would go due north. What happens is Penn's agent over here, James Logan, blazes trails northwest. At the ending point, you will do a 45-degree angle into the Delaware River. If you go due north and you go 45 degrees, parallels the longitudinal lines. But if you go northwest, that 45-degree angle becomes far more severe. And then they hire the equivalent of Olympic sprinters. Lenape people start out. The walk starts at the Wrightstown meeting in Bucks County on Route 413 and goes the whole way up to Jim Thorpe. It's about between 60 and 65 miles. In the first day at basically lunchtime, the Lenape drop out. They're disgusted with what's going on. They protest through English channels. They do not get satisfaction. They are forcibly removed from this land, and it begins the forced removals of Lenape people here. The Lenape people were at one point in a little bit of Connecticut, in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Northern Maryland, in Delaware, and all of New Jersey. That was their turf. Today, there are 5 descendant communities that are recognized by government. 2 are in Canada, and 3 are in the US. 2 of them being Oklahoma-based. The Schwenkfelder Museum is partnering with one of them on an upcoming project, and 1 in Stockbridge, Wisconsin. The group that the Schwenkfelder Museum is partnering with faced 8 forced removals to move them from here to their current headquarters in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And then government says, nope, we're just kidding. You got to move again. And you got to move again. 1778, the American Revolution is well underway. Some Delaware people had sided with the French during the 7 Years' War. After the 7 Years' War, the English government, specifically the Penns, had to pay reparations to now Delaware people. As Lenape are moved away from their homeland, colonists start to refer to them as those people that lived along the Delaware. That's where that name comes from. Delaware is actually a hereditary title of the governor of Virginia, Thomas West, who asks an explorer to map the coast north of the Virginia colony. The Chesapeake's already named, so the next major water course that that explorer runs into, that explorer names after his benefactor, Thomas West, the 3rd Earl Delaware. Thus we get the Delaware River. The next river, because the guy's as vain as the next guy, Henry names after himself because his last name is Hudson. At the time of the Revolution, the Lenape had been mishandled by English government. So they choose to side with independence. The first organized tribe, technically nation, to sign an allegiance with the fledgling United States, the Lenape, the Treaty of Fort Pitt, 1778. When I visited them in Oklahoma 2 years ago, their cultural center is filled with pictures of tribal members going back to the advent of photography in their variety of US military uniforms. Their chief Currently, Brad Kilscrow is a Navy vet. They take great pride in their national service. And because I'm familiar with him, I had actually asked, you know, the US government has really mishandled you. And he says it's not so much about the US government, it's about protecting the homeland. And they will do that. And they have stood their place since the American Revolution. The Native American leader who negotiates that treaty at Fort Pitt, which will establish a 14th colony in the Ohio Territory for Delaware people. It will give them seats in Congress, and it will have their children going to Princeton. His name is White Eyes, and within a year, he will be assassinated by a member of the Continental Line, the American Army. White Eye's son will go to Princeton. He is the only one ever. He leaves in disgust because there's such prejudice against him. And at the end of the American Revolution, before the Treaty of Paris, there are Lenape people living in the Ohio Territory. There's raiding going on by hostile tribes. The Pennsylvania militia is dispatched to a place called Gunottenhooten, where these Christianized Native Americans are living peacefully. They surround the town, the militia does, and they give the Lenape people one night to make their peace. They sing hymns in the church and so on. And the next morning, to save ammunition, Pennsylvania militia uses coopering mallets to dispatch almost 100 of them. One member of that militia unit, and there was a small contingent that refused to take part, he will ultimately adopt one of the two surviving Lenape children who have been scalped and left for dead. But it is a sad part to a very proud and I would say current Native American group. In closing, I would really encourage everyone to, first off, attend Jeremy Johnson's program. You'll get a lot more Lenape history from him and correct Lenape history. They also have websites. The Delaware Tribe of Indians and the Delaware Nation, their history is up on their website. They have a talking dictionary. We talked about one word in their language, Perkiomen, here. They also have a number of different words, and they have a language expert who's claimed about 1,600 words so far. My closing one is a Lenape word, which is just thank you. So, Wanishi. At this point, if you have questions, I'd love to take them. Sure. I have, and so yes. So the question was the term Lenny Lenape or Lenny Lenape. I mean, how many of you guys have heard Lenape and living in this area? So the language expert is actually a Pennsylvania expatriate. His name is Jim Rementer, and he is a treasure. He grew up in the Poconos. He's not Lenape, but was studying language. So 50 plus years ago, he moves to Oklahoma to study the dying Lenape language with the last native-born speakers. One of the last surviving ones, Nora Dean Thompson, she adopts him. In Lenape culture, he is as much a tribal member as somebody who carries the bloodline. And I asked Jim about Lenape, and he says, it hurts my ears. It's Lenape. And Lenny is a redundance. It's almost saying Lenape, Lenape. And you don't find reference to that until the early to mid 1800s. And that's kind of a white affectation, we think. It's really not a Lenape thing. But great question, because I've heard it so many times in the neighborhood. Other questions, guys? Yeah, sure.
What did you say William Penn left the Pennsylvania colony?
For the last time?
Yeah.
1701. It's fall of 1701. Yeah, and he was fully planning on returning. He basically tells Hannah and the daughter from the first marriage, it's like, oh, you guys stay here. I'll be back in 5 months. They're like, don't leave us in this godforsaken wilderness. We're going with you. And it was wise that they did, because Penn, while he wanted to return here, and I would say my commercial plug for Pennsbury Manor, first off, March 8th is a sad date, as that is the anniversary of the Gunottenhooten massacre. but at Pennsbury, we celebrate Penn getting the charter to Pennsylvania. It's a Sunday afternoon. It's a free admission day. So mark your calendars. If you're free, please come out and join us. For Penn and his family, Pennsbury was the only home that he designed and had built from the ground up. Every other home that he would own was already extant. So we like to believe at Pennsbury that was his ideal of good living. At least that's my shtick. Other questions, guys? Sure, sir.
I got lost. What is the difference between Lenape and Lenape?
Okay, they're the same people. Lenape is the historic name of these people, and that's the name that those within the bloodline, or they prefer the term community to tribe. They would call themselves Lenape. The Delaware name is kind of placed upon them, but when they move through governmental processes to be a recognized tribe, they use the word Delaware as their tribal name, but it's interchangeable. They're the same people. Yes.
I have a comment that I'd like you to go further with. When you said the Susquehannocks,
Yes.
the Paxton boys killed all of them in Lancaster and everything, but there were 2 people left. There was at Benjamin Hershey's farm, 2 of the older ones, they hid them in a cellar to keep them safe, and then they lived out the rest of their lives, and they're buried there on the farm. So they were the last of the Susquehannocks, as far as my knowledge is.
Those that would be carrying on the name Conestoga, we call them, modern historians call them Susquehannock. And frequently there are cultural groups that we find in the archaeological record. As a young archaeologist, I actually worked on a place called Shanks Ferry, which is southern Lancaster County. It was a very distinct culture. They had very distinct pottery styles and so on. We don't know what they called themselves because they were gone before white contact. So they talk about the Shanks Ferry culture just because of the geography, just like with the Susquehanna drainage, the Susquehannock. We believe that those people, the 2 that survived, and there would have been other survivors, not necessarily the massacre, but they would have been amalgamated into other tribes, intermarried and so on. And one thing that I will say for some of the native peoples, when it comes to repatriating human remains and restoring their ancestors back with proper burial and so on from archaeological collections, there is more than one group that will take in Susquehannock remains, thinking that the Susquehannock had intermarried and traded with their people and so on, so that they can give them the respect that they need.
So considering them, those last 2 people.
Yes.
But then Susquehanna.
Again, I would say, think of Conestoga and Susquehannock like you think Lenape and Delaware. They're the same people, just different people using different names for them. Sure, absolutely.
When do you think the last Indian would have left this area?
Okay, I'm going to give you a tongue-in-cheek answer. Bart Cartwright lives about 6 miles north of Pennsbury Manor. He's a member of the Delaware Nation. So we still have some living among us. As far as with the forced removals, French and Indian War period, but you have people who stayed behind, who intermarry and so on. In Chester County, Hannah Freeman is famous in the early 19th century as being the last Lenape person living in Chester County. Whether that is true or accurate is a matter to debate. In the eyes of the federally recognized tribes, if your ancestors stayed behind and integrated into white society, you gave up tribal affiliation, you quit the team. So today there are groups locally here who claim the lineage of the Lenape. They are private, not-for-profit groups, but they are not recognized by the federal government. They can't make that criteria. And so when Pennsbury wants to get accurate information about the history of the Lenape, we turn to the federally recognized tribes. This was advice that I got from the founding director of the Smithsonian Institution for Native Americans. His name's Rick West. And he took me on my first visit to Oklahoma and made introductions for me. And again, I think the many years that academic historians and archaeologists had been dismissive of Native traditions and stories and so on, we're finally getting academic scholars who are from these federally recognized tribes. And there's a great book, Stories My Grandmother Told Me, which is a collaboration between a long ago Pennsbury staff member who now teaches at Rutgers and a PhD academic within the Delaware community. And these are all stories that have been passed down within the Delaware traditions. Yes, sir.
The sweet sounding letter that Penn wrote to them. Has to be translated. How do they work that? Do they hire translators to turn that letter into the Lenape tongue?
It's a great question. Yeah, so the question was, okay, this English schmuck, William Penn's cousin's going to show up with this letter written in English. How are you going to translate it into their language? 25 years ago, there was a book put out called Into the American Woods, and it was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize in American History. And it's about the go-betweens, the translators between Native communities and European settlers. So there's this guy that's here who actually came over, he's a Finn, starts out with a Swedish colony, stays because it's a Dutch colony now, and then stays because it's an English colony. His name is Lasse Cook. And Lasse Cook, actually, there are payments from William Penn to Lasse Cook for being an interpreter. So you have these people who have lived among the Lenape. A later example will be somebody that lived with the Iroquois. His name is Conrad Weiser. He becomes an Indian negotiator for the Penns right after the Walking Purchase, which if there's ever a time you don't want to take that job, that's when it is. But he was conversant in the Algonquian language. And as far as native language goes, kind of think of the Algonquian language like German. Somebody who's Dutch can understand High German. A Swiss German can understand High German, and so on. So you could move among these different communities and kind of make yourself known. Lasse Cook will appear in a lot of the legal documents and so on, and he's just one example of those translators that were here. There's actually a Lenape woman who had learned English named Aliquippa, and Aliquippa is also a translator. So, and going back to Squanto, once the Pilgrims land, they have established their fort. They've had rough rubs with the Pilgrims and the local Indians for about 6 months after half of them starved to death. They've cleared a field of fire outside of the fort off Fort Hill, and this guy comes walking out of the woods carrying his weapons. He makes it halfway across. He lays his weapons down, walks up to the door, raises his hand, and he says, "Welcome, Englishmen." And I was like, holy moly, this guy speaks the lingo. His name is Samoset. And the trade fleets or the fishing fleets that had put in to resupply for almost 100 years prior to this, he had picked up enough of the language. He spends the night with him, but he says, you know what, my language isn't so good, but there's this guy that my king owns, a slave named Squanto. He's a great translator. So Squanto actually gets between these two, and some historians feel he's playing two sides against the middle. But sometimes those translators will be indigenous, and sometimes they will be European. Yes, Mitch. Okay.
It's in my American history class many years ago. The capital, which is in photos, of the Delaware Indians was said to be Shaxamaxon, current Germantown. Still thought to be accurate.
So I would say no. Yes. So the question was taught in an American history class was Shackamaxon, which is in the Philadelphia area. It's down where the casino is now. was that the capital for Native peoples. I think those of us of European descent all struggle and try to make Native people fit into a European mindset. Go back to that idea of Scottish clans, that no one person has a capital. So 19th century historians have gilded Shackamaxon as the place of kings. Remember I told you about the language expert from the Poconos? So I asked Jim, I'm like, Jim, what does Shackamaxon mean? He goes, it's the place of eels. It's where we went eel fishing. That is what it translates in their language. It was a good meeting point. It's where people hung out and so on, but it wasn't the place of kings. And because we want to gild that Eurocentric history, we've, inflated things in ways that they don't need to be. So I will certainly, I know we need to wrap up the program. I will stay and take questions. But we do need to, I think, wrap up for our online guests. I want to thank you guys for being a great audience and so attentive. It's been fun.
Thank you again to Doug.